Okay, let's go to the tax rate then.
All right, let's move to back at page 10. So I gave you a couple of examples of different iterations of the tax rate, just to sort of show you if we use reserves, what that might look like, or use anticipated surplus, I should say. And I've bulleted this down at the bottom of the page, but I'll just sort of walk through what the bullets are for you. So obviously column B is this year's tax rate. Those are the numbers from this year. Column B is basically to show you what the tax rate would look like if we didn't use any anticipated surplus. So we didn't have any money available to help support at the education spending number, and it was just a flat voted budget, local revenues, the new property yield, and an estimated equalized pupils figures. What does that look like? And so that's an 8-cent increase on your equalized tax rate. All right. What we've proposed in the draft that you've seen is what you see in column D, and that is using 764,000 surplus to reduce education spending, which drops the tax rate down to 3.9 cents. All right, so 4.1% decrease. That 764 comes from last year's, how we ended the year, right? We ended the year with a big surplus. Last year, we asked the voters to transfer the anticipated surplus of 509,000, I think it was, to the tax stabilization reserve, which we've done. And we're recommending that we use the balance of that surplus that wasn't originally presented to the voters to transfer and go ahead and reduce the tax rate. It's a lot of money when you look at it, but it's only 4 cents. So it cuts that tax rate increase in half, which is fantastic. But you'll see as we move further, we're still going to see some significant tax rate increases. Column E, I created just to show you what would it look like, what would we need to take out of anticipated surplus to reduce the tax rate if we were just going to go up by 2 cents, meaning that 2 cents that we have no choice in because that's that Act 46 incentive change, right? We had a incentive decrease of 4 cents last year. We're in year 4, the final year of our incentive, so we have a 2 cent variance. It's basically a 2 cent increase in our tax rate when all is said and done. And that would be an additional $346,000. And that could come out of our anticipated surplus from this year, because we do still intend to see a surplus at the end of this year. And it would still leave us with about, I don't know, around $55,000 of anticipated surplus if everything stayed as it's presented right now. So that's an option to consider. It's not the one that we're recommending on the table right now. As we talked about with the return of surplus from the BRSU, any use of surplus, if all things being equal next year, you're going to see an increase because that surplus is no longer available to use. Now, we do have that $500,000 set aside in tax stabilization. It was voted, it's there. We're not intending to touch it right now with this presentation, but of course that's on the table as well. So I just want to move on to packet page 11 before we talk about that any further and show you what this looks like on a town-by-town basis, because this is the part that gets difficult, right? We know what an equalized tax rate is. We can compare it from year to year. It's a number. It's easy to work with and show a variance. But now when we go town by town, we're throwing common level of appraisal into the mix. And that changes things for everybody, because most of the towns are seeing their common level of appraisal go down, which means your tax rates are going to go up. So we have a variance in the towns that are seeing their common level of appraisal go down. Their tax rate is going up, even though we are showing a 3.9 cent increase in the equalized property tax. The actual property tax rate will go up between 5 and 11 cents. So it's substantial in some towns. And that is because you have a common level appraisal going from, for example, in Dorset, 108% down to 103%. And that is automatically going to raise that tax rate up quite a bit. So it's a lot of explaining we're going to have to do to taxpayers, and hope that they are paying attention and can see that our voted budget is going down, right? But our tax rates are going up. And so we'll do our best presentation-wise to explain that in all the FAQs like we usually do, but it's going to be one of those get the word out things, I think. So questions? I'm going to point out one other thing on the tax rate calculation. Equalized pupils is still an estimate. So right now, you know that your ADM was kept level at last year's numbers. We don't have final, we don't have poverty numbers. We don't have the state place counts in the system from the state yet. We don't have the final factor, and that final factor is what we're really looking for. State hasn't given us any of this data. They're still working on it, even though it was due on the 15th of December. So I'm hoping that 1723 is, we're not going to see it. I'm hoping we're not going to see it go down further.
I think it makes most sense to follow column D. Column E, while it might reduce the tax rate a little bit, does tap into, in a material way from my perspective, the possibility of surplus, and that won't be available in 2023. So I'm in favor of D, and I think that's about the best we can do, and it's an appropriate use in this year of a way to use the surplus to minimize the tax increase.
Jim?
Yeah, actually I had one question. Since there's the ADM freeze for this year from the legislature, are they going to be calculating equalized pupils using the ADM freeze?
Yes, and that's what this number is based on.
Okay. Also, just to kind of say, I agree with Dick, basically, on that point.
John? And then Deb?
Can you explain a little bit more? Can you just remind us about the ADM freeze? And also, what do we, for equalized pupils for 9 through 12, has there been a net gain there, do you expect?
So so in talking about this year, right, equalized pupils 2-year ADM average, and so this year our ADM count was down. It was less than last year's ADM. And I, to be honest, would have predicted it would have been down anyway, but certainly not down as significantly as it was. Mm-hmm. A lot of that due to homeschooling. And I think in TNG we have a count of 59, I want to say, if I remember correctly from the list Celeste shared with me. So it's a big number, right? Much bigger than we've seen in the past. And so instead of using that ADM number that has dropped, we're held level at last year's ADM. So it's a 2-year average of last year's ADM.
Okay.
Now high school.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So high school itself, has high school gone down? I would have to look to see if the specific 9 through 12 numbers, ADM, have gone down from last year. I want to say they have, but I could look at that for you. Obviously, they're held level in the calculation, and we don't get to separate that out, right? So ADM is your final ADM is your ADM. So if our ADM number is 1700, then we're not going to go below 1700. They're not going to pick and choose by grade, right? So even though, even if our high school numbers alone might have been going up, that's not what they're using in the formula. They're holding us level the last year. Just
anecdotally speaking, as a teacher at BVI, I've seen a lot of transfer students coming from out of state, and I know that it might not affect ADM much, but the equalized pupil being their high school, won't they be weighed more? And
yep. Yep, they are. You get a 0.13 on that.
Okay, so that could be advantageous to us potentially, right?
Well, it's already in the formula. So it's already in that 1723, right? All of that is calculated in.
Okay.
And so you have to remember what happens too at the end of the day. We get a calculated number, which includes that 0.13 on all our high school kids. And then the entire number is brought down by, say, a 0.94, because we can't have, at the end of the day, we can't have more kids in the state in total than actually exist. So they bring us all down by that same factor to get us to the right number of kids that actually exist in the state. And that's really the biggest number that we're waiting on right now that will decide whether or not that 1723 goes up or down. and again, it relies on the entire state, right? This is a calculation that Brad at AOE is doing based on all of our data. For next year, my bigger concern is that, as you see in your budget, right, we see high school going down, and we are seeing that because of that smaller 8th grade class coming in and the 12th graders going out, which in turn could reduce our ADM numbers next year. And it's, you know, who knows what they'll do about ADM next year, but we can't be sure that they're going to hold it level again. There hasn't been any conversation about this continuing after 1 year.
What's the
Not
gain
quite.
from that? If we budgeted for 15 Phantom students, then we'll run a surplus if there is, in fact, there's a decrease.
If they didn't show, right? If they didn't show, we would still have that money in our budget. But with respect to counting, you're counting actual kids, so it wouldn't matter what we budget for with respect to the count. But yes, with respect to surplus, if we budget for those 15 kids and they don't come, then that money's still sitting there for us to use on other things. If we don't budget for them, then we have the potential of running a deficit.
All right, thank you.
That was
And
next.
that's about a penny and a half. It's about 1.5 cents on the tax rate, those extra 15 kids.
Last night at BRSU, we talked about explaining to the voters that whole decision about how much of the surplus we use this year and how much we reserve, just because how it will affect next year. Even just this ADM count, we don't know what's coming next year.
Right.
Voters at one point might wonder why we don't just return all of our surplus.
Yes.
But there are good reasons why not to, and it's just weighing the risks and the advantages one year against the next. And
Yep.
maybe that would be a good thing to explain in our FAQs.
Yep. Thanks, Deb.